Good morning and welcome. We have 4 speakers with talks on drones and the discovery of medieval transcripts bracketing presentations on educational and pay equality for women. We'll have 2 20-minute talks, then an intermission, and then the 2 remaining talks. Before we start, a few reminders. First and foremost, please remember to turn off your cell phones and beepers. During questions, please remember to give your name and location at the start. And for the break, remember that this room behind me, as well as the room by the entrance, has food and drink. This morning's first speaker, Lisa Ellman, is a partner in the law firm of Hogan Lovells, where she chairs the practice on unmanned aircraft systems, more colloquially known as drones. Ellman also currently serves as co-executive director of the Commercial Drone Alliance in Washington. She previously served in senior positions in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, the Office of Management and Budget, Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, and the Office of Presidential Personnel. Ellman received her bachelor's degree in history from the University of Michigan, her JD from the University of Chicago Law School, and a master's of public policy from Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy. Throughout her career, Ms. Ellman has worked to bridge the knowledge gap between government policymaking and business innovation, advocating for policymakers and innovators to collaborate so that regulations are not years or decades behind the technologies they aim to regulate. A pioneering drone policy advisor, Ellman wrote her first policy document when she was 8 years old, according to an interview with Fortune. This document laid out the fines for her younger brothers if they were to say mean words. She is a woman for our times in more ways than the meetings committee might have imagined. We need you, Lisa. Ellman's writings on drones law and policy have appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, and Fortune. She was recently featured in Fortune's Most Powerful Women series for her efforts to develop policy to govern drone use in the United States. She will speak this morning on policy in the age of drone fever. Lisa.
Good morning. Great to see you all bright and early here in Philadelphia. First, let's give a round of applause to our drone operators. I don't know if they're still, but how cool was that? They did a fantastic job. Well, it's an honor to be here today and to talk about my favorite topic, drone fever. Thanks to all of you, to the American Philosophical Society, thanks to Annie Westcott and Howard Gardner, Barbara for that kind introduction. Thanks to all of you for inviting me to be here. Just out of curiosity, anyone here actually own a drone? Okay, we got a couple. Anyone at a university perhaps using drones for research? Or use drones in your line of work, or seen them in your line of work? Okay, a few more, good. Anyone excited about drones? Excellent. Anyone worried about drones? Okay. Okay, good. Well, we're going to talk about all of that today. Now, we've seen incredible innovation over the last few years, and technology has really moved forward quickly. And what used to be considered toys are now tools of industry and public safety. So here's a slide of lots of different amazing use cases. Drones really provide incredible safety and efficiency benefits to companies in our country and around the world. They can respond to disasters. They can deliver our packages, as I'm sure you've heard Amazon wants to do. They can gather and convey the news. They can farm our crops, and everything in between. The FAA has projected that there will be 11 million commercial drones sold in the US by 2020, just 3 years from now. That's from just a couple thousand right here this year. So this is going to really be growing exponentially, this market. And the economic potential for the industry is great. But they have safety and privacy implications when misused, as we're hearing about a lot on the news these days. It's been an exciting few years for this brand new industry, and it's growing rapidly. But innovation doesn't happen in a vacuum. And it's a timeless issue that technology can move right along, but it can't properly be enabled without the right policies in place. So I'm going to talk today about the U.S. approach to drone policy and highlight some issues that may actually hit your desks before too long. Now, the U.S. has struggled a bit responding to this emerging technology, falling behind much of the world in enabling commercial drones. Many other countries, Australia, UK, Japan, have been using drones commercially for many years now. We've made substantial progress here in the United States, but there's a lot more that remains to be done to open this industry to its full potential. I'll talk about the drone laws and policies and some of the challenges facing the industry, and offer some ideas on how we should be thinking about these issues. Now, first, some background on me, and you heard some of this from Barbara, but I get asked all the time, how did you become a drones lawyer? And is there such thing as actually a drones legal practice? The answer is yes, and my background is I'm a policymaker. I worked for the Obama administration for many years. Barbara mentioned that I was at the White House working at the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And I was there from 2011 to 2013. And in 2012, Congress mandated that the federal government integrate drones into our national airspace. The technology had moved forward quickly, and there was lots of demand from industry and public agencies to use this technology, but there was nothing in place that would allow us to be able to do so. So Congress passed the FAA Modernization and Reform Act in 2012, mandating that the federal government integrate drones into our national airspace. And while the FAA had been paying attention to this, Federal Aviation Administration, had been paying attention to this for a long time, the whole of government really, at that point, started to pay attention and working on this issue. So almost overnight, I was shortly thereafter asked to go run drones policy at the Department of Justice and be on the White House interagency team tasked with considering all of the first-order issues that come along with integration of drones into our national airspace. What are the privacy and safety and security issues related to drone integration? Here's a slide from NASA. They're leading the unmanned traffic management efforts, designing highways in the sky. And this is something that we're talking about with them, working hand in hand with NASA on every day. But this really helps articulate some of what we're worried about. And we saw the drone flew in. Was anyone nervous that the drone was going to hit them? Good, because it didn't fly right over us, right? But in the future, folks are going to be wanting to fly where people are, including over people. And that's a safety issue that we have to worry about. This drone flight was very short, but companies want to be able to fly beyond visual line of sight. They want to be able to fly far away. They want to be able to fly over buildings, over soccer games, under other aircraft, under helicopters. How does all of this work? And what does this mean? And how can we do so safely and in a way that wins the public's trust? So I was fascinated by all of this, and eventually I decided to work on these issues from the private sector side. I now lead the drones global practice at Hogan Lovells Law Firm and lead the Commercial Drone Alliance, an industry group focused on moving this industry forward and working with policymakers on these issues. So let's take a step back and talk about where we are right now. The FAA for this summer, for the first time ever, as of August 29th, the use of commercial drones is now legal here in the United States. Previously, you had to get actually a special license from the FAA if you were a company wanting to fly drones for commercial purposes. This was a very big deal here in the US, and I'll talk more about that rule in a moment and what it allows. But we've seen other federal government activity around commercial drone use recently. For the first time ever, the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House in just this past August hosted a major symposium around drone innovation, bringing public agencies and private industry together to talk about the benefits of this technology. This was having worked in the federal government and working on all the safety issues and spectrum issues and security issues. This was really the first time that the government had an outward-facing event focusing on the innovation exciting part of all this. And for the first time ever, at least one of our presidential candidates did consider drone issues. I worked as Hillary Clinton's drones policy advisor. Now, it wasn't quite a policy election, and it wasn't quite the result that we had hoped for. But this is, I think, a nonpartisan issue. So hopefully the new Trump administration will pick up where we're leaving off. But this recent progress comes on the heels of a several-year period during which policymaking moved quite slowly. And over the last few years, we've seen hundreds of state and local bills introduced that would limit drone use in communities. According to the National Conference of State Legislatures, 45 states considered 168 pieces of drone legislation in 2015. So far in 2016, at least 35 states have considered legislation related to drones. So there's a ton of interest out there in every state looking to limit drone use in some way, although some other states are also very excited about the use of drones. I was in Syracuse, New York this week, where they announced a big drone innovation zone project with the governor. They're putting $250 million towards developing this drone innovation zone in New York, which is going to be a really wonderful thing. Now, these state laws and rules generally focus on privacy issues, which have really captured the imagination of the American public. A recent poll showed that 59% of the public was extremely, very concerned about privacy issues, whereas only 40% were worried about safety issues. Most people were at least moderately concerned about both issues. So I'm just going to talk about each of these quickly in turn. So on safety, the FAA does an incredible job keeping our airspace safe and secure. That is their statutory mandate, and that they do this better than any aviation entity in the whole world. But the FAA is not mandated to promote innovation. That's just not what they do. And while they understand the 747 from the inside out, they just aren't familiar with drone technology. But because a drone is actually legally, by statute, considered an aircraft, the federal government has essentially bolted the new regulation of small drones onto the old manned aviation regulatory structure. This has led to all kinds of absurd results. And it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But that's where we are. Now, in the US, one of the leftovers from the manned aviation regulatory structure is the primary focus in the first instance on operator intent rather than risk. So under current law, drone users are regulated based on what their intent of the flight is. Are they a hobbyist? Do they want to fly for fun? Are they a public entity, flying for a public agency, for example? Or civil use, which is essentially any non-recreational use. Hobbyists, if I'm just flying for fun, can do anything they want as long as they're flying under 400 feet, within visual line of sight, within a general community-based set of guidelines. And here we're talking about very small drones, under 55 pounds. For commercial users, Part 107 is this new small drone rule that broadly authorized flights under 55 pounds, up to 100 miles an hour, within visual line of sight, away from people in airports, during daytime hours, with a remote pilot certificate that you can get by taking an aeronautical knowledge test and having a background check. Now, the rule coming out was a really huge deal for the industry. A few ideas just help explain where the FAA is coming from on all this. Right now, the FAA is regulating as if drones will fall out of the sky or fly away at any time. So they don't care if that happens, as long as there aren't people underneath the drone, so that when it falls out of the sky, it doesn't hit anyone on the head. And if it does fly away, I can see it flying away, so I can press return to home and make sure it comes back to me and returns to home. But that said, it's also true that in order for all of us and for society to be able to take advantage of the many benefits of drones, including the economic benefits and safety benefits, we need to be able to routinely fly beyond visual line of sight and fly near people. For precision agriculture, farming applications, for example, pipeline inspection, railroad inspection, many of the best use cases, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to use a drone if you have to pick up and follow the drone every mile or two. To respond in a disaster, a nonprofit organization needs to be able to fly near people. So there's been a lot of pressure on the FAA to move quickly to expand operations. The rule does bake in some flexibility. It establishes a waiver process for case-by-case approvals. For example, CNN is a client of mine. I recently secured approval for CNN to fly a tethered vehicle over people for news gathering purposes. They're actually the only company in the country that's gotten approval to fly over people. But we're already all looking forward to what's next, and here we'll see some authorizing rules that will allow safe operations near people, over people, beyond visual line of sight, night flights, that kind of thing. I would note that the academic community has played a very critical role here by providing data. When you're a policymaker, you're generally privy to lots of data, lots of numbers. You're based on past experience, and here we have a brand new industry, and so we just don't have that data, which has been a challenge for the whole community. One item from the academic community that would be helpful to understand is what is an expected level of safety from the public? The FAA uses numbers from the manned aviation context, but it's not clear that makes sense in the drone context, and we really don't have much data on that. Now, I mentioned earlier that while the federal government has been primarily focused on safety issues in towns and communities across our country, the privacy concerns are what captured the imagination of the American public. Many in the industry believe that drones are just a platform for a camera. Not so different from pole cameras or helicopters or satellites. And this is generally true, but it is also true that Americans perceive drones differently. Some University of Oklahoma researchers conducted a survey that found that levels of opposition were much higher for using drone-mounted cameras than ground-mounted cameras for precisely the same tasks and to capture the same information. So this means that many in the public think of kind of an eye in the sky when they think of the word drone. They think of a predator or reaper gathering intelligence overseas, and these are very different things, and worried about a drone hovering outside their window. Companies have this same worry, right? Companies are worried that competitors will use drones to watch their property or projects or steal trade secrets. So with all of this concern, it's not surprising that there has been so much legislation aimed at limiting the use of drones in the name of privacy. There was recently, on the federal government side, in May of this year, industry representatives met with privacy advocates and others and came to consensus with privacy advocates in academia on a set of best practices around commercial and private drone use. That process was run by the National Telecommunications and Information Agency at the Department of Commerce. And one thing that really became clear was that there's a lot more research necessary around public perception issues related to drones that would be helpful as related to privacy. Simply because, again, we don't have the data, we don't know exactly what the privacy issues are. As a policymaker, when you're asked to regulate privacy, there's of course a whole body of privacy laws and rules out there that are technology neutral. Where are the gaps as they relate to drones such that we need new laws, we need to fill gaps, and what can we do about that? Now, I'm going to mention one other legal issue relating to privacy, more like property rights, but I think you'll be hearing a lot, perhaps land on your desks one of these days. The idea of airspace ownership. You guys are Latin experts. Does anyone know how to pronounce this? Anyone know what this means? Okay. To whomsoever the soil belongs, he also owns to the sky, right? Latin for I own my land, I therefore own the sky above. The idea is we have a property right in the sky above our homes, at least to a point. This makes sense, right? I hear this all the time from people worried about others flying drones over their backyards, but also from people wanting to fly commercially in their own backyard, which under current rules, you have to follow a long set of rules. This question of airspace ownership has been considered in a number of court decisions, but none involving drones. It's easy to forget there was a whole body of aerial trespass law even before the emergence of the airplane. For centuries, it was generally considered that landowners owned their airspace. Tree branches over my property, or hunters sending bullets over my property, or a building tilted over my property, these were violations of my airspace. But with the invention of the airplane, lawyers and policymakers took a fresh look at the concept. The ability to fly people in the air was generally considered to be a public benefit and wanted to promote innovation. And the newly emerged aviation lobby was strong. They strongly made the case among the bar and to policymakers that airspace was a public good. Landowners were not organized, but meanwhile, individual landowners were having some trouble. Some living in the vicinity of airports were experiencing very low flights over their property, maybe 100 feet overhead. It was clear there was some violation, but it was not clear was that a nuisance? Was that a trespass? What was that? So there was a 1946 Supreme Court case, United States versus Cosby. The Supreme Court considered whether a family keeping chickens in their backyard had property rights in the air 83 feet above their backyard. Military planes, this was 1946, so military aircraft were taking off and flying very low over their property, scaring the chickens and killing the chickens. It was a takings case against the federal government, and the Supreme Court said it was a violation, since the airspace was in the immediate reaches above the land, into which intrusions subtract from the owner's full enjoyment of the property. But then separate, so okay, we know 83 feet, looks like I own that 83 feet over my backyard. But in the law enforcement context, the Supreme Court has generally said that there's no problem, no reasonable expectation of privacy from public airspace, including 400 feet above my house. To make things even more complicated, the FAA would say they have jurisdiction over the blade of grass to the sky. So it's really unclear how all of this is going to translate in today's world. There's a federal court case in Kentucky right now dealing with these issues. A guy shot his neighbor's drone out of the sky. The drone was flying 200 feet over his property. So the question is 200 feet? The argument is that 200 feet is public airspace, therefore it's not possible that I was trespassing on his property because it's public. It's a fascinating question and totally unclear. Now, the reality is that drones are going to need somewhere to fly, and we need to balance this need with individual property rights. NASA, I mentioned, is working on designing an air traffic management system for drones, highways in the sky. NASA is working with private industry partners on this. Now, we're short on time, and I want to get to questions, so I won't spend a lot of time talking security, but I do want to mention that I'm getting a ton of inquiries these days about, with the new proliferation of drones everywhere in our skies, counter-drone technology. What do I do about rogue drones flying? I don't want drones flying over my backyard. What can I do about it? Now, the policymaking here is also lag behind the technology. It is clear that we can detect, identify, and track rogue drones, but what then? What's the solution? Shooting down a drone isn't the answer. You're making things more unsafe. Jamming a drone interferes with other signals and runs afoul of FCC regulations. Some are taking over a drone and landing it, which this technology does, also could run afoul of computer fraud statutes. Some are training eagles to attack drones. Maybe that's the answer. There's no shortage of ideas out there, and it'll be interesting to see how this goes. Now, we've talked today about some of these legal and policy issues on a very, very high level. But given the novelty of the issues that we're talking about, courts and academics really, truly have the opportunity to play a critical role in the development of this new industry. It is important to keep in mind that there are technological solutions that innovators are developing now that will help alleviate some of the policy concerns that we are most worried about. We're always, as Americans, coming up with technological solutions to our problems. Our cars have brakes. Our computers have privacy settings. Our phones have the do not call list. So the industry is hard at work to perfect drone software that will make operations safer. We can actually make that drone smarter than the person taking it out of the box. There's a lot of promise here. After the drone landed on the White House lawn, its manufacturer announced it provides technology on all of its drones to prevent them from flying in restricted airspace, like in Washington, D.C., or close to airports. Collision avoidance technology, for example, can prevent drones from crashing into us, or even from getting close to us. This is why I believe in a concept called pollivation, policymaking that promotes innovation, but innovators need to work hand in hand with policymakers to get these questions right. A lot of the folks, I can speak from my own experience, a lot of folks in the federal government working on drones policy issues are not familiar with this technology. They need to learn about it, and that's where innovators come in. The success of this industry really depends on the efforts of both parties to promote innovation while winning the public's trust and confronting controversial issues like some of them that we've talked about today, like safety, privacy, airspace ownership, and security. The industry could really use the brain power in this room to make progress on these issues. So thank you for having me, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Fabulous, Lisa. So I'll call on people. You
Just
you
stay here? Okay, sure.
Questions? Erwin.
Erwin Shapiro, Cambridge. Fascinating talk. I was wondering what the policies are now or contemplated in regard to armed drones, like they could be used by hunters, say, you know, to kill deer during the deer hunting season or something like that. Or they could be, person feel they have the right to carry a gun in a drone just like they can carry a gun now in their pockets.
Yeah. No, it's a great question. I don't know if anyone saw the gun that was mounted to the drone in Connecticut. That has now become an FAA investigation. A college kid mounted a gun onto a drone in his backyard and started shooting in his backyard. Now, there was no one around. The question is, does that actually violate an existing law, right? You're recklessly endangering the public. He says that there was no one around, so I wasn't recklessly endangering anyone. I have the ability to hunt, say, from helicopters, so why can't I hunt with my drone? But this is it's a great question, and it's a really controversial topic these days. And part of it depends, I think, on who's using the drone. So we have the law enforcement use of drones. There's a lot of question about whether law enforcement, for example, doesn't it sound like it might make sense in a riot situation that a drone could use tear gas to break it up. Well, that's non-lethal use of force on a drone. And avalanche control, there's all kinds of different reasons that you can imagine that the government might be interested in arming their drones. North Dakota recently just tried to regulate that by saying that the conversation in the legislature started by saying we want to ban the use of armed force on drones. But because there are all of these law enforcement interests in perhaps an active shooter situation and using non-lethal force, the rule actually ended up stating you may not use lethal force on the use of, with a drone. However, you may use non-lethal force. And of course, the headline was, North Dakota authorizes use of force with drones, which led to a lot of headaches for folks in North Dakota. The reality is, it's a great question. And the question is the use of, if I shoot someone, if I murder someone, whether with a drone or with just a gun, I'm still murdering someone, right? You're still violating technology-neutral sets of laws and rules that are already out there. The question is whether we need new laws and rules to prevent that or to provide incentives against that kind of activity. But I think that most of what you would do with that activity, most of what would happen would already be illegal. The FAA has subpoenaed the individuals in Connecticut and doing an active investigation right now, and it would not surprise me if that ends up, we end up seeing that in the courts.
Emily Baker, Washington, D.C. Drone technology is obviously moving very, very rapidly, and our regulatory systems, legal systems, move rather slowly in our system. I wonder if you could expand a bit on pollination and just say something about what you think the best way to proceed with this is. For instance, is it really going to have to go through the courts? Do you think it could be done without having to be done on a case-by-case basis, as so many of these decisions are made? I'm just curious about how you see the process unfolding and trying to keep up with the technology.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's a huge challenge in this industry. And as a policymaker working on these issues, it was a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge for policymakers as well. My vision of pollination is really innovators working together with policymakers. The problem in this case, and I touched on this, the FAA is wonderful at what it does. They regulate airplanes. Most of the folks that have been tasked with integrating drones into our national airspace have never seen a drone, have never held a drone, don't understand drone technology. So they say, well, for example, in order to be able to fly safely in the national airspace, you have to certificate your drone. In the manned aviation context, an airline will go through that process, and it will take between 2 and 5 years, 2 on the very low end. So it takes about 5 years to get your vehicle certificated. In this industry, in 5 years, we've gone through 20 different versions of the same vehicle, right? This drone that we saw fly in will be outdated in a few months. I mean, that's just the reality of this technology. It's constantly changing. So one kind of regulatory framework just doesn't lend itself well to a very fast-moving, technologically savvy industry. So I think that policymakers need to get educated on these issues. One question is, what are some of the policies out there that can be solved by many of the technologies that we have, and then provide incentives for manufacturers to adopt those technologies. Right now, there aren't incentives for manufacturers necessarily to include propeller guards, for example, because right now, the FAA, when it looks at flights over people, it's considering only kinetic energy. It's not considering safety mitigations, as an example. They're not considering kind of the whole of government approach that could help make drones safer and take care of a lot of the policy concerns. So that's where I see if I was drone policies are for a day. I would want to get folks in a room and have a real workshop of, here's what we're worried about, how can this be solved, how can we provide incentives to get there. We also need, all of these federal government agencies have interests. So for example, FCC is working on the spectrum side of these. Right now, all drones use generally unlicensed spectrum. But in order to fly cargo, package delivery, for example, or to fly beyond visual on a site, we need to have some dedicated spectrum to these drones. They haven't come to the table yet. So we need to get folks engaged and working together. And my hope is that the next administration will do that, but that would be my view.
Let me intervene and ask a question.
Sure.
One of the things with any kind of technology like this, and I'm I work in artificial intelligence, so everything we're doing raises the question of whether people are paying attention to low-resource communities as well as wealthier communities as they consider these various ethical and design trade-offs. And so I'm wondering, as you think about this and making policy, whether the industry and the government people are actually thinking about those communities as well.
Absolutely, it's a great question. And I think actually, I mean, so many of the benefits of drones come in communities which have less money. Just as an example, broadcasters in rural communities generally can't afford a helicopter. Having a drone allows them to have some form of aerial coverage, which will then, consumers of news benefit from. There are already drone delivery companies. We were just talking about Zipline, a medical supply delivery company with drones that's working in Rwanda and around the world for humanitarian purposes. And this technology can help us here in the U.S. as well. But unfortunately, the rules have not allowed package delivery. They have not allowed for a lot of the more innovative activity that could really help some of the communities in need. That's where I think we really need to try to communicate the benefits better so that people understand the reasons that we need these regulations and enabling regulations in place so that we can actually take advantage of all their benefits.
Great. Rich?
Yeah, Rich Schiffer in Indiana. Maybe you could say something about the issues related to privacy and security relating to what I understand is this firm, I think it's in Dayton, that proposes to or has been taking continuous movies of entire city for crime-fighting purposes. I think they tested it out previously in Mexico and are having some trouble getting permission to do something similar in cities in the U.S., but in Dayton, I think it was in particular.
Well, so the same kind of Fourth Amendment, law enforcement operates under the same Fourth Amendment restrictions with drone technology as with any other technology. And I think persistent surveillance, aerial surveillance is fine, but there has to be, there are obvious reasonable expectation of privacy issues there. So local police has traditionally had kind of their police power, sometimes broader abilities, but none of that, frankly, from a technology perspective, it's a battery on a drone lasts about a half hour best, so there's just no way that you're going to go use it for persistent surveillance. Yeah, you could maybe use a tethered drone, but cities are using pole cameras for that purpose. I think when it comes to law enforcement use of drones and it comes to privacy, and I worked at DOJ, I wrote the DOJ policy on drone use. I worked with the FBI and other law enforcement agencies who are using this technology. The key really is transparency and engaging with the American public and learning how they want law enforcement to be using drones in their communities. Because if not, there's going to be a lot of outcry. And Alameda County in California experienced this a year or two ago where they bought some drones for use. They actually had a few public meetings, no one attended, and then it came out in the news that they had bought drones with public money in order to save money and save officer lives. But because they hadn't gone the extra mile and had a lot of public conversations and put out a privacy policy, there was a huge blowback in the community. They then had some more, when people think of a drone, they think of a predator or a reaper. There's a lot of confusion out there about what the word drone means. And the vehicle that we saw fly in here was not threatening in any way, correct? But this is when people think of a drone, they think about a reaper or predator being flown to gather intelligence abroad, overseas, and they worry that that's what's happening here in the U.S., which is simply not the case. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and so part of our challenge, part of the industry's challenge, part of the government's challenge is to educate the American public so that we're all on the same page and we all have the same facts as we're considering these questions.
Well, let me ask everybody to thank Lisa for educating us. It's been a great talk.